and accurately assess it in a reproducible fashion so we can count on it being true value. Can you discuss that more?
Well, that's what validation is, in that, first of all, we have to prove that what we find in a specimen is what we say. Is it really, like for this instance, is it a mycotoxin? So as I pointed out, we have to seed a negative sample and then try and detect it with our system and compare it to a known system. We compared it to mass spectroscopy when we were doing these validations. So we know we have a substance, and then we'd have to determine at what is the lowest level of detection that we can do or detect this toxin in by doing various titrations of the specimen. Now, when we do that, we can then say this specimen or this test is validated. However, we have to do ongoing validations all the time on the test. And that's what College of American Pathology and CLIA and any regulatory agency was initially set up to do, to compare, to make sure laboratories, if laboratory A does a ProTime, for example, the ProTime in laboratory A is the same as laboratory B, so they had to do something called an INR to compare these. And that's what they test. That's how they do the comparisons. Well, we have to do something called proficiency testing. So if they send us unknowns, we have to get the same as other laboratories. Now, in a specimen or a test like what we have in mycotoxins, there is no proficiency testing agency. So we have to make our own, and we have to be ready for any kind of investigation or evaluation. We also have to go back and look at patients over a period of time. So we save specimens and freeze them. And then we test those patients again and again and again over a period of time for months, and we've done this for years. When I first started, I tested every month, then I tested every 6 months, and then we went back for 2 years in those frozen specimens. We now test a specimen whenever we change a lot of a test reagent. So that's part of a validation as well. So it's ongoing testing all the time to make sure you repeat and you get the same values or very close to them within a standard deviation or a coefficient variation that is statistically approved. I hope that answers your question. Yes?
Slide on disease association with mycotoxins, and it showed that the urine captured a great quantity. Were the patients that had the sinusitis and the other problems all part of the urines?
Yes.
So anybody who had sinusitis had a positive urine?
No. No. That's. I don't think that's how I had that data.
So what I was trying to get at is the urine test the best test to do, and should it be positive if the person has problems with sinusitis related to those mycotoxins, or should you try to target that organ?
Well, did somebody, I hear, I'm sorry? Yeah, we do accept, and we have looked at nasal washes with saline washes. I think that's how you do it, Dr. Ray. And so we have found mycotoxins in the nasal washes. But if we find mycotoxins in the urine, that's abnormal and shouldn't be there. So they should be evaluated there. Yes, Dr. Ray.
Dr. Hammond, enjoyed your talk. Which areas are the chaparral terpenes found? And is there another name for them?
The terpenes?
Yeah. Chaparral terpenes.
Well, the particular picture was from a textbook in ecology, and wherever you see it a lot in desert regions. We were traveling in Arizona and Nevada this last fall, and you see the spacing out of plant. And so there may be other things besides terpene, but with chaparral, the terpenes are in the leaves. And so when the leaves drop to the ground and decompose, and the terpenes are in the ground and they inhibit the neighboring plant life. But I think you see it very generally in the desert where there's competition for water, that that there's a spacing of vegetation. And a large part of that, it's not that when they cast their seed that they do a geometric evaluation of where the seed should go. When the seed gets cast universally, and then whether there's conditions there for growth. And it has partially to do, at least, with the toxic substances that the successful plants are putting into the ground.
Yeah.
From an environmental perspective, I just want to crystallize what, I'm not sure if it was Dr. Almond or Dr. Strauss, but from a mycotoxin perspective, you talked about it's excreted to the spore and the other hypofragments and so forth, but then there's been studies to show that there hasn't been any spores that have been found in the samples. So I know that most of the testing that you do through dust collection, is it the mycotoxin being diffused, or is it writing other particulates that create that type of result?
Well, is this on? Everybody here? If you think about a Stachybotrys colony, they grow because there's a tremendous amount of water, right? And remember, these mycotoxins can be soluble in water. They're much more soluble in, say, something like ethanol, but they can be soluble in water. So the water then solubilizes the mycotoxin and removes it from the colony, and then the colony, and then that water dries up. Now you have the mycotoxins in dust, free of spores. Wind current comes along, picks it up, mycotoxins in the air. So that's how you find mycotoxins without spores.
And the other thing is that these are organisms, they live and they die. So they may have deposited the mycotoxin while they were alive, and then they're gone, they're fragments now. But the mycotoxin that's in the environment, they're exotoxin. And there's been some discussion offered that if you want to do some kind of exposure analysis to mycotoxins, you have to calculate what the volume of the spore is that the particles represent, which speaks to the idea that the only thing you're seeing are fragments of spores. Okay, but you're not only seeing fragments of spores. You're seeing those. You're seeing mycelial fragments, but you're seeing the toxins out on the substrate and on the dust, and calculating the volume of a spore to make some equivalent to the very sparse data about the concentration of toxins in spores, which Bill Sorensen did one, and he said absolutely you can't use this in risk assessment. Others have done that. There have been some putative risk assessments done using concentration, using Bill Sorensen's data or other people's data about how much mycotoxins is in spores, and then saying, therefore, if we can measure spore exposure, which we can't for reasons that I can discuss if you wish, but that then you can calculate whether or not it's, the amount of fragment is equivalent to a spore. It has nothing to do with that. They're exotoxins. The basic ecology of the toxigenic molds is that they put them out into the environment for competition purposes. They're inhibiting. Remember the antibiotic discs on the bacterial lawn. Why did Fleming see the inhibition with a species of penicillium? Because they secreted penicillin out into the environment.
How many of you have heard of the ERMI test that the EPA has approved? We look at the ERMI test quite a bit, not for the ratios that the EPA has touted that we should look at. But we look at that because we want to see how many organisms or the type of organisms that are found in a gram of dust. Now, for those of you who don't know what the ERMI is, it's Environmental Readiness Moldy Index. Relative. Yeah, what did I say? Relative. Yeah, Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. And ERMI, it's easier to say. And what it is you give them an amount of dust, and only 18 laboratories in the country are approved by EPA to do these, and they will give you 36 organisms that are, they will number how many organisms in a milligram of dust. And they say their DNA, it's a polymerase chain reaction, real-time PCR test, and so they say it's the number of equivalents, spore equivalents, and that's very good for a lot of reasons because you can tell what organisms are there. However, we have done the trichothecenes and ochratoxin tests in the patients. We find trichos, and when we look at the ERMI test or look at the spore evaluations from the environmental people, there's no stachy, there's no fusarium, and there's no trichoderma. And it kind of confused me, so I talked with Strauss, who said, tell him to go back and find the stachy somewhere in the house, and because if you're finding tricho, you find in the patient, it's got to be there. And I think we've done it most of the time. What we've decided to ask the patients to do is to give us some dust. We will separate it, send it to an ERMI approved lab, and then we do the mycotoxin on it. And surprising to us, where we find an amazing amount of mycotoxins is under the refrigerators. How many of us ever clean under our refrigerators? Mentioned that to my wife, and so I clean it, she won't, but it's just disgusting. We've found 50 to 100 parts per billion of trichothecenes in that dust under the refrigerators. Where we also look is in the filters, the air conditioner filters that you buy at Home Depot, and you can lift those out, and we just take a 2 by 2 inch piece of that they send us. We extract it, and we do the mycotoxins, and we find trichos and ochres a lot, and then we also send that sample to the ERMI labs. And so there is some correlation. I don't know what you all think about that, but it is helping some of the clinicians decide what to do. I guess I'd like to hear some comments about that.
Not a comment, but a question. And I think this can help me crystallize